program. I'll let his words behind me speak for themselves as to why he is unqualified to speak on this program. Even Elon Musk suspended him from Twitter for his extreme views. Mr. Rosiak's history shows he starts with a point of view, one which I find abhorrent, then spreads misinformation and conspiracy theories to support his views, and that is not journalism. For the past almost 50 years, the 8A Business Development Program has broken down historical barriers that underserved small business owners face when trying to contract with the federal government. Decades of research backed by real stories of discrimination and statistical analysis show that historical discrimination has created an unequal playing field in government contracting. It also shows
you're watching the future crash into the present like a freight train painted in techno-feudalist colors, and you need to understand immediately that what you just witnessed isn't a spontaneous confrontation, but rather the weaponization of elite billionaire power against democratic accountability. At a hearing about historic discrimination, where a senator dared to invoke the one name that supposedly represents our new oligarchic overlords' commitment to free speech, while simultaneously revealing the entire architecture of modern censorship to be an inversion so complete that we're now debating whether being banned by a billionaire constitutes credential enough to testify before Congress, because this is where we are, my friends. This is the moment where American fascism learned to speak the language of content moderation, and you better buckle up because Elon Musk's efforts to infiltrate and eviscerate government agencies have moved from conspiracy theory to congressional testimony in a matter of months, and the sheer audacity of a Democratic senator weaponizing that suspension as a badge of extremism when we know that Musk temporarily banned a handful of left-leaning journalists critical of him in December 2022, and did this again in January, tells you everything about who gets to define reality in our cascading information hellscape. This clip drops like a bombshell, precisely because it reveals what progressive critics have been screaming into the void for years, which is that the Daily Wire is rated right-biased based on story selection and editorial positions that align with the conservative right, and mixed for factual reporting due to the promotion of propaganda, and a few failed fact-checks. But wait, it gets so much worse because the fact that a senator has to begin her interrogation, not with questions about policy or evidence, but with an ad hominem assault on credibility based on social media suspension, tells you that we've entered an epistemological nightmare, where the gatekeepers of truth are the same people who own the platforms and the politicians who curry favor with them. The senator declares that this reporter's words speak for themselves as to why he's unqualified, and then immediately pivots to say that even Elon Musk suspended him, as though Elon Musk somehow represents the arbiter of democratic legitimacy, when the reality that X acted on 71% of legal requests it received to remove content during the first half of 2024, up 20% from 2021, and more than the roughly 30% of requests it complied with in prior years, demonstrates that Musk is actually far more compliant with authoritarian censorship than the previous Twitter regime ever was. And here we have Democratic senators using his censorship apparatus as proof of extremism, which represents such a catastrophic philosophical collapse that Hannah Arendt would need to write a new volume on the banality of algorithmic evil. Listen to what's happening beneath the surface of this exchange, because when you hear about the 8A Business Development Program breaking down historical barriers for underserved small business owners facing discrimination in government contracting, you're witnessing the battle lines of American political economy being drawn in real time, and Republicans have strategically invited someone they can discredit, not based on his argument, but based on his digital excommunication from a platform owned by someone who is now reportedly violating cybersecurity procurement and privacy laws by recklessly handling federal systems and data, while simultaneously serving in an unofficial capacity to gut the federal workforce. This is the con you need to see clearly because SBA announced a comprehensive full-scale audit of its 8A Business Development Program, following a DOJ enforcement action that uncovered extensive fraud, bribery, and abuse within the program, including the steering of more than $550 million in government contracts through illicit means, which means Republicans can point to real corruption in equity programs and use those failures to discredit the entire project of remedying historical discrimination, while ignoring that corruption exists everywhere in government contracting, not just in programs designed to help marginalized communities. The theatrical brilliance of this moment lies in its misdirection, because while everyone focuses on whether this Daily Wire reporter has extreme views or whether his Musk suspension delegitimizes him, the actual substance vanishes into partisan theater, and you realize that The SBA began requiring all 8A participants, whose program eligibility was based upon individuals who relied upon the presumption of social disadvantage, to establish their individual social disadvantage by completing a social disadvantage narrative, and in light of the new ruling, the SBA must now determine that the discrimination or bias experienced by an individual is chronic, substantial, and has occurred within American society, following a court decision that essentially gutted affirmative action in government contracting by eliminating racial presumptions of disadvantage, which is exact the policy outcome conservatives wanted, and now they bring witnesses to congressional hearings who can be dismissed on procedural grounds rather than engaging with the statistical reality that decades of research backed by real stories of discrimination demonstrate historical barriers that created an unequal playing field that persists to this very day. But here's where it gets absolutely nuclear, and you need to pay attention, because this isn't just about one hearing or one reporter, or even one program, but about the wholesale reconstruction of American power, where at least 14 conservative accounts said that X had revoked their blue verification badge, cutting them off from premium features, including the ability to monetize their accounts through subscriptions and advertising revenue sharing, after they criticized Musk's views on immigration in December 2024, which means Musk censors left and right alike, based not on principles, but on personal grievance and political calculation, yet we're supposed to accept that his platform suspensions carry epistemic weight in determining who qualifies as an expert witness before the United States Congress, which is so profoundly corrupt as a standard that you have to wonder whether anyone involved in this hearing understands that legitimacy cannot be outsourced to tech billionaires who have demonstrated repeatedly that they will use their platforms as weapons against anyone who challenges their interests or their ego. The Democratic senator calling his opinions abhorrent and dismissing his work as misinformation and conspiracy theories rather than journalism might feel cathartic to progressives who rightfully recognize that multiple scientific studies have identified the Daily Wire as a fake news website and that many Daily Wire stories repackage journalism from traditional news organizations, while adding a conservative slant, and fact-checkers have said that some stories shared by the Daily Wire are unverified and that the Daily Wire sometimes misstates facts to advance a partisan view, but the procedural move of using platform suspension as disqualification sets a precedent so dangerous that it essentially hands editorial control over congressional testimony to whoever owns the digital public square, and right now that person is someone who's making it impossible to make the cuts targeted without steep cuts to programs and services that all Americans count on, including education, food safety, air traffic safety, wildfire prevention, affordable housing, the FBI, and the DOJ, while operating with unprecedented and unaccountable power over federal operations. You want to talk about extreme views? Let's talk about the extremism of allowing concentrated private power to determine the boundaries of acceptable political discourse in a democracy, because what this senator is doing, whether she realizes it or not, is legitimizing corporate censorship as a tool of political credibility assessment, which means tomorrow when Republicans control the Senate again, and they bring forward Democratic witnesses, some future GOP senator can point to suspensions from X or whatever reactionary platform emerges next as evidence of unfitness, and the whole edifice of democratic deliberation collapses into a recursive loop where only those approved by oligarchs get to speak truth to power, except there is no speaking truth to power anymore, because the oligarchs are the power. The senator mentions decades of research backed by real stories of discrimination and statistical analysis, showing that historical discrimination created an unequal playing field, and that discrimination continues to this day, which is absolutely correct, and represents the overwhelming consensus of social scientists, economists, and civil rights researchers, but she undermines her own argument by beginning with an attack on credibility, rooted in algorithmic punishment, rather than engaging directly with the substance of whatever this reporter plans to say. Think about the meta-context here, because we're in December 2024 watching this unfold, and Representative John Larson criticized Elon Musk and shouted at his Republican colleagues after Musk's testimony was blocked before a hearing of the House Ways and Means Committee on March 12, which tells you that Democrats have been trying desperately to get Musk himself to testify to explain his role in gutting federal programs and his unprecedented conflicts of interest, but Republicans block that testimony while simultaneously inviting witnesses they can attack using Musk's own censorship decisions, which is such a perfect encapsulation of how power operates in late-stage capitalism that you could teach an entire semester on hegemony using just this one clip. Ranking Member Connolly motioned to subpoena Elon Musk to testify before the Oversight Committee, given concerning recent reports of Elon Musk's efforts to infiltrate and eviscerate government agencies. But that subpoena goes nowhere. while this Daily Wire reporter whose relationship to truth and evidence is at best contested gets a platform and then gets martyred for his suspension, creating a perfect persecution narrative that conservatives will deploy for the next election cycle. The structure of this confrontation represents everything wrong with how we conduct political discourse, because instead of beginning with the question, does historical discrimination exist in federal contracting, and do race-conscious remedies work, we begin with, is this person allowed to speak? And the answer to that question is determined not by democratic principles or evidentiary standards, but by whether a billionaire who has made Twitter way more political in its moderation and focus way less transparent and way more willing to cave to governments in takedown demands and requests for user info, decided on a whim or through some opaque algorithmic process to ban someone. This is the same Elon Musk who received the most requests for user information from the US and complied with 76% of them. And for all of Elon's misleading talk about how the old Twitter was really an extension of the FBI, it seems notable that old Twitter sued to reveal details of DOJ requests and Elon's way more willing to comply with them, which means the entire free speech absolutist pose is revealed as cynical brand management, designed to provide cover for ideological censorship that serves his business interests and his increasingly reactionary political alignment. And before anyone accuses this analysis of being too sympathetic to right-wing media, let me be absolutely clear that the Daily Wire operates as a partisan outlet that, according to a 2023 study in Harvard Misinformation Review, disproportionately traffics ineffective polarization content designed to trigger emotional responses rather than inform, and that its business model is predicated on culture war grievance mongering that undermines constructive democratic engagement, but that critique has to be made on the merits through patient documentation of factual errors and logical fallacies and transparent debate, not through appeals to the censorship decisions of someone who represents the apotheosis of oligarchic capture of public infrastructure. When the senator says that this reporter starts with a point of view which she finds abhorrent, then spreads misinformation and conspiracy theories to support his views, she's making a substantive claim about methodology that should be adjudicated through examination of his actual work, not through reference to his suspension from a platform where X temporarily shut down progressives for Harris in August, demonstrating equal opportunity suppression of voices Musk dislikes regardless of their ideological valence. The irony absolutely drips from every syllable, because here we have a Democratic senator invoking Elon Musk as an authority figure on extremism and misinformation, when NBC reported in June 2025 about the status of child protection on Twitter under Elon Musk, stating that many aspects of the child
exploitation ads issue remain the same on the platform. And BBC News reported in August 2025 that they had discovered a network of more than 100 accounts openly selling child pornography on X, which suggests that Musk's content moderation priorities have absolutely nothing to do with protecting vulnerable populations or maintaining epistemic standards, and everything to do with protecting his ego and his financial interests. So when this senator uses his censorship apparatus as proof of extremism, she is functionally arguing that we should defer to the judgment of someone who allows child exploitation to proliferate on his platform while banning journalists who report critically on his companies, which is such a morally and intellectually bankrupt position that it should disqualify her argument completely, except that we're so far down the rabbit hole of algorithmic epistemology that nobody even notices the contradiction anymore.
And let's zoom out to the civilizational stakes, because what you're watching in this clip is the final phase of a decades-long project to replace democratic accountability with technocratic management, where expertise becomes suspect, competence becomes elitist, and the only credentials that matter are whether you've been blessed or cursed by the algorithms that determine visibility, engagement, and ultimately credibility in our digital public sphere. The 8A program that forms the backdrop of this hearing emerged from the merger of federal contracting policies promoting small business contractors with those focused on preventing discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities in federal contracting markets following executive orders in the 1940s, seeking to end employment discrimination, and evolved after civic unrest in the late 1960s when SBA programming sought to support business ownership by African Americans and other minorities, which means it represents a direct response to centuries of violent exclusion from economic opportunity. But now conservatives can invite witnesses to attack these programs, and Democrats respond not by defending the overwhelming evidence that discrimination persists, but by attacking the witnesses' social media history, which seeds the entire terrain of argument and allows Republicans to claim that Democrats care more about Twitter drama than about addressing real problems. The script has been flipped so thoroughly that up becomes down, because Musk, who faced blowback for appearing to cave to government censorship demands, including by removing some accounts and tweets at the behest of the government of Turkey ahead of elections, and who complied with many requests from countries such as Turkey and South Korea, and acted on 68% of cases requested by Turkey, which has strict censorship laws, and is led by President Erdogan, who has asked Musk to build a Tesla factory in his country, is somehow positioned as the defender of free expression, while journalists and activists who criticize concentrated private power are framed as extremists. This represents such a complete inversion of Enlightenment values that Voltaire would weep, except Voltaire also couldn't get verified on X if he criticized Musk's labor practices, so maybe the parallel is more apt than we'd like to admit, because we live in an age where the ability to speak depends entirely on your relationship to power, and those who challenge power get algorithmically disappeared, while those who serve it get amplified, regardless of their relationship to truth. The hearing itself becomes unwatchable as democratic ritual because everyone knows the outcome before it begins. Republicans invited this witness specifically so they could create a spectacle where Democrats attack him on procedural grounds, allowing conservatives to play victim and claim censorship, while simultaneously undermining programs designed to remedy discrimination, and Democrats obligingly perform their role by making the hearing about the witness's credentials rather than the underlying policy, which means nothing gets resolved, no minds get changed, no legislation emerges to address actual problems, and we all get a little bit dumber and a little bit more cynical about whether democratic institutions can do anything other than produce viral content for fundraising emails. The senator correctly identifies that the 8A program has operated for almost 50 years to break down barriers, and that decades of research demonstrate ongoing discrimination, but she packages this substantive claim inside an attack that begins with Musk's suspension, which means the story that travels through media ecosystems isn't discrimination, persists in federal contracting, but rather Democrats attack conservative journalists for being banned by Elon Musk, and the conservative persecution narrative gets stronger while progressive policy goals get obscured. You're watching the construction of American fascism in real time, and it doesn't arrive in jackboots and book burnings, but in the subtle reconfiguration of epistemic authority, where private corporations determine who gets to participate in democratic deliberation, and elected officials ratify those decisions by incorporating them into official proceedings. The fact that we're even debating whether someone's suspension from a social media platform should affect their ability to testify before Congress represents such a fundamental misunderstanding of democratic principles that you have to wonder whether anyone involved has read a single word of political philosophy, because the entire point of representative democracy is that citizens get to petition their government and present evidence regardless of whether those in power find them agreeable or credible, and the determination of credibility happens through transparent debate and examination of evidence, not through reference to opaque content moderation decisions made by unaccountable billionaires. When the senator says that the reporter's history shows he starts with a point of view, then spreads misinformation to support it, she could be describing literally any ideologically motivated media outlet, including those on the left, but the asymmetry of power means that conservative misinformation gets broadcast through well-funded media infrastructure, while progressive critique gets shadow-banned and demonetized, which is why one commentator said he noticed that fewer people have been seeing his posts and stated that he can see on his analytics page that his posts aren't getting as much traction as they used to after criticizing right-wing narratives. The meta-crisis here involves the complete breakdown of shared reality, where we can't even agree on what constitutes evidence or expertise, because everything has been filtered through ideological sorting mechanisms that determine visibility based on engagement metrics that reward outrage and punish nuance, which means the most extreme voices on both sides get amplified, while reasonable people trying to solve problems get ignored, and this dynamic serves the interests of oligarchs perfectly because it prevents collective action while maintaining the appearance of democratic participation. Republicans understand this better than Democrats, which is why they're constantly working the refs by crying censorship whenever platforms try to enforce basic standards against misinformation, while simultaneously celebrating when those same platforms ban leftists and Democrats keep falling into the trap by taking the bait and making everything about credentials and procedure rather than substance, which allows Republicans to position themselves as populist underdogs fighting elite censorship, even though they represent the interests of the wealthiest Americans and serve corporations that extract wealth from working people while destroying the planet. The 8A program discussion that should form the centerpiece of this hearing gets completely buried under this meta-debate about witness credibility, and that's not an accident, because the 8A program has been under scrutiny over the past few years, and in 2023, a federal district court enjoined the use of the SBA's rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage for certain enumerated groups in the administration of the SBA's 8A program, which represents a major victory for conservatives seeking to dismantle affirmative action. And they don't want substantive discussion about whether discrimination persists because the evidence overwhelmingly shows that it does so. Instead, they create spectacles where the debate becomes about whether Democrats are being mean to their witnesses rather than whether their witnesses are telling the truth. And Democrats keep obliging them by taking the bait, because it feels good to dunk on conservative media figures, and because the progressive base demands confrontation, but this tactical satisfaction comes at the strategic cost of losing the argument with persuadable voters who see Democrats attacking people for their social media suspensions and conclude that Democrats are more interested in culture war than in policy. What makes this moment particularly insidious is that it weaponizes progressive concerns about misinformation and platforming extremism and turns them into tools of oligarchic control, because when you establish the principle that people can be excluded from democratic participation based on content moderation decisions, you create a mechanism that will inevitably be captured by those with power and used against those who challenge that power. The senator thinks she's being principled by refusing to legitimize someone who spreads misinformation, but she's actually establishing a precedent that will come back to haunt progressives when Republicans control the committees, and when right-wing billionaires control even more of the information infrastructure, and when the definition of extremism shifts to include anyone who wants to tax wealth, or regulate carbon, or challenge imperialism, because the machinery of censorship doesn't care about ideological consistency, it only cares about power, and right now, power is consolidating in ways that would make the robber barons of the Gilded Age jealous, except this time, they own the means of communication itself, not just the means of production. The reporter standing behind those words that speak for themselves represents a particular strain of conservative activism that absolutely traffics in distortion and grievance, but the correct response is to dismantle his arguments with evidence and expose his methodology as flawed, not to argue that he shouldn't be allowed to testify because the marketplace of ideas isn't actually a marketplace when some ideas come backed by billions of dollars in funding and sophisticated propaganda networks while other ideas get suppressed by algorithmic curation, and the only solution is more speech, not less, more transparency, not less, more engagement with substance, not more credentialism, and procedure. When this senator pivots immediately from attacking the witness to discussing the 8A program and the decades of research showing discrimination, she undermines her own substantive case by leading with the ad hominem, because now Republicans can say, see, Democrats won't even engage with our arguments, they just want to silence us. And that narrative resonates with millions of Americans who feel like coastal elites look down on them and dismiss their concerns, and the fact that those Americans are being manipulated by plutocrats doesn't change the political reality that Democrats lose when they make credibility rather than evidence the basis of their arguments. This is the endgame of neoliberal capitalism, where all public goods get privatized, including the public sphere itself, and where the logic of the market infiltrates every domain of human activity, until even our ability to determine truth or falsehood gets outsourced to platforms that optimize for
engagement rather than accuracy, and politicians from both parties go along with this because they benefit from the fundraising apparatus that runs on outrage and polarization, even as they complain about polarization, and the whole system becomes a self-reinforcing loop, where the same people who created the crisis get to position themselves as the solution. The senator's frustration with this Daily Wire reporter is completely understandable, because conservative media has spent decades building an infrastructure of misinformation that poisons democratic discourse and makes it nearly impossible to build coalitions around shared interests, but her response plays directly into their hands by making the story about silencing rather than refuting, and by ceding epistemic authority to Elon Musk of all people, someone who represents everything progressives should oppose, from his union-busting to his climate denialism to his increasingly overt white nationalism, but somehow Democrats keep treating him as a serious person whose judgments carry weight.
We're living through the collapse of the Enlightenment project, and nobody wants to admit it, because that would require acknowledging that the institutions we trusted to preserve democracy have been hollowed out and captured by interests that benefit from chaos, and that the information ecosystem that should allow us to coordinate collective action has been weaponized against coordination, and that the path forward requires rebuilding trust and shared reality from the ground up, which is much harder than dunking on conservative media figures in congressional hearings. The 8A program that forms the backdrop of all this represents one small attempt to address centuries of discrimination through technocratic management and targeted assistance, And it has real flaws because any program administered by a massive bureaucracy will have inefficiencies and opportunities for corruption. The solution is to fix those problems while maintaining the underlying commitment to equity, not to use those problems as an excuse to dismantle the entire project, which is exactly what conservatives are doing, and Democrats aren't offering a compelling counter-narrative because they're too busy litigating who gets to speak, rather than what should be said. The viral nature of this clip demonstrates everything broken about our political culture, because what should be a dry policy hearing about government contracting becomes a moment of high drama that generates millions of views and intense polarization and absolutely zero progress towards solving actual problems facing actual people. The fact that this reporter got suspended by Elon Musk tells us nothing about whether his claims regarding the 8A program are accurate, or whether the program effectively addresses discrimination, or whether there are better ways to promote equity in contracting, but it tells us everything about the attention economy that rewards conflict over consensus and spectacle over substance, and this senator, whether she realizes it or not, is feeding that machine by making her opening statement about the witness rather than the issue, and she's doing it with the best intentions, believing she's defending democratic norms by refusing to platform extremism, but she's actually corroding those norms by establishing that access to democracy depends on approval from unaccountable private platforms. And if you think I'm being too hard on Democrats, remember that Republicans would be infinitely worse in this scenario, and have been worse throughout American history, but the asymmetry of power means Democrats have to be better, because they're the only major party even pretending to defend multiracial democracy. And when they make unforced errors like leading with attacks on witness credibility based on social media suspensions, rather than engaging substantively with arguments, they make it harder for everyone who believes in justice and solidarity and collective action to build the movements we need. The reporter who stands accused represents a media ecosystem that profits from rage and distortion, but the Democratic Party also operates within a similar ecosystem, just with different aesthetic markers, and until progressives build alternative institutions that can compete with conservative media infrastructure without replicating its pathologies, we're going to keep losing these battles even when we're right on the substance, because being right doesn't matter if you can't communicate why you're right in ways that resonate with people who don't already agree with you. This hearing, whatever else happens after these opening remarks, will produce no legislation to improve the 8A program, no bipartisan consensus on how to address discrimination, no accountability for fraud and abuse in contracting, whether in equity programs or elsewhere, and no increased public understanding of how government procurement works, because that was never the point. The point is to create viral moments that can be clipped and shared, and fundraised off of, and to continue the endless war of position, where each side stakes out territory and lobs artillery at the other, without ever advancing, because advancing would require compromise, and compromise would require acknowledging that the other side has legitimate concerns, and that acknowledgement would alienate the base that demands total victory, and total victory is impossible in a democracy, which is why democracies are dying around the world and being replaced by oligarchic authoritarianism dressed up in democratic language. What we just witnessed isn't democracy in action, it's democracy in decay, and the decay accelerates every time we substitute credentials for arguments and procedure for substance, and algorithmic judgment for human wisdom. And the tragedy is that everyone involved probably thinks they're doing the right thing, defending important principles, standing up to dangerous misinformation, but they're actually participating in a ritual that makes democracy weaker, not stronger, and makes oligarchy more entrenched, not less, and makes the future harder to imagine as anything other than descent into feudalism with smartphones.